You're starting a new Java application, and in this app, you need to talk to another service over HTTP. This could be a service within your own organization, or this just could be some public API that you need to consume. How do you do it? There are many libraries that you could pull in to help you with this, but there's one built into the JDK that I want to take a look at today, and that is the JDK's HTTP client. Hello, my name is Dan Vega, and I'm a Spring Developer Advocate at Broadcom. I make videos on Java, Spring, or anything that I find interesting, so if that sounds like your cup of tea, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Today, what we're going to do is use a public API out there called the JSON Placeholder Service. This is a service that anybody can access without any authorization credentials, and it will just give us a good example of working with another service. So in a Java app, I need to talk to this other app, consume the data, and then use that in my application. So this is a pretty typical example, right? So in this JSON placeholder service, there is a to-dos endpoint. So if we scroll down here, we see to-dos. And if we go into to-dos, there is a list of 200 to-dos. Each to-do is comprised of a user ID, an ID, a title, and then whether or not it's completed. So this is great. This is a good start to get us to work with an outside service, pull down some data, and check it out. So let's do that. We're going to hop over to IntelliJ, start a new project. I want to make sure you're comfortable with this too. You do not need to use IntelliJ. I'm using IntelliJ's Ultimate Edition. This is a paid version that I pay for on my own, and I've done that for a long time now because I am productive in it. IntelliJ has a free version. There is Visual Studio Code. There is Eclipse for Java. You do not need to use IntelliJ to do this example. I want you to make sure that you are using whatever tools you're most productive in. If that happens to be IntelliJ, great. If not, please feel free to do this in another tool. With that, I'm going to head over to IntelliJ and start a new project. All right, so here we are in IntelliJ. I'm going to go ahead and click New Project. There are a bunch of different generators on the left-hand side. I'm just going to create a new project. We're going to use Java, and I'm going to call this the To-Dos HTTP. I'll put this in my Downloads folder. We're going to use Java. I said we're going to use Maven. I'm using the latest version of Java, which at the time of this recording is JDK 21. But as long as you're on 11 or further, you should be okay because that's when the HTTP client was introduced. We're going to come into advanced settings. I'm going to set my group ID to dev.danvega. The artifact is to-dos HTTP. With that, I'll go ahead and click create. All right, so when the application opens, we're in the pom.xml. This is part of the Maven build system. If Maven is completely new to you, I'll go ahead and link to a video I did on getting started with Maven. But with that, we'll go ahead and close this. I'm going to go into source, main, Java. There is no app yet, so let's go ahead and create a new file called application, and we'll go ahead and do public static void main sysout hello world, and we just want to run this and make sure our application works okay, and there's our hello world. We are off and running. So what I want to do now is create a new package. I'm going to create a new package in here called to do, and I like this structure because it's called package by feature. So I'm kind of packaging everything up by its feature. So in an e-commerce app, that might be customers, orders, products, etc. I'm putting everything related to to-do, even though this is just a to-do app, in a to-do package. So I'm going to say new class, so new Java class, and we'll call this the to-do client. So in the to-do client, I want to be able to talk to that REST API that we looked at before. Now, to do that, I'm going to need that base URL. I'm copying it behind the scenes right now, and I'm going to say private final string, and we'll call this base URL. And inside of there, we will say that we are going to jsonplaceholderservice.com/todos, right? That's our base URL. Then I'm going to need a constructor. So I'm going to say, here's our constructor. And I want to create an instance of the HTTP client. So the first thing I need is the actual client. This is what is going to make calls to other services. So I'm going to create this here because this is something that we'll use in every method. So when we go to get a list of to-dos, when we go to get a single to-do, we'll go ahead and use that in every place. So I'm going to say private final HTTP client. You'll see that comes from java.net.http, and I'll call this client, and that's it. So what I want to do is go ahead and initialize that, create an instance of it in the constructor. And the way that I'll do that is I'll just say client is equal to HTTP client. Now, if we look at HTTP client, we'll see that this is an abstract class. we see if we go to the structure, where's the structure? There we go. We'll see that there are a couple of static methods in here. So the abstract class, you can't create an instance of it. You can't say new HTTP client, right? But there are some static methods that will call the builder and build a new instance of it for you. So go ahead and look through the docs, understand what you're doing there. But for this kind of getting started, all we need to do is call new HTTP client, and that'll give us an instance of the client. Great. So the first thing we want to do is get a list of all the to-dos in the system. So how can we do that? So the first thing we'll do is we'll create a method called findAll, but right now it's just going to return a string. We're just going to get that raw string of all the JSON data, and then we'll talk about converting it over to a type of, say, to-do. So I'm going to say findAll, and we'll just say return null for now. Actually, we'll just return that. The first thing I want to do is I need to create a request. So the client is going to send a request and get a response. That's its job. But a request is its own thing. A request is, hey, what type of request is this? A GET, a PUT, a POST, delete, etc. For a GET or for a POST, maybe it's here's the type of data I'm sending and here's the body. For a GET, here's the URI that we want to call. So the request can be very simple for like this GET that we're going to do. It could be a little bit more complex for, say, a POST. But we need a request. And the way that we get a request is through the HTTP request class, again, in that same package that we just saw. So I'm going to say HTTP request.new builder. So we're using this builder style syntax to create a new instance of the request. And the first thing that we do is set a URI. Now we've already declared that up top with that base URL, but we can't just send a string in here because we've created this as a string. Let's look at URI. It expects a URI. I wish there was like an overloaded method for this, but it is what it is. So we can use the URI class to say, go ahead and create a URI from this string. Here's my base URL. So far, so good. Now we need to say what type of request it is. What is the request method? In this case, it's going to be a GET. And finally, I'm just going to call build on it to get an instance of the request back. So in my ID, I could say .var and turn this into a variable. So yes, request looks good. Now I have a request that I can go and send off using the client. So that's what I want to do. So I'm going to say, hey, client, go ahead and send this. So I'm going to send a request. Here's the request. I've already given you that. Now, if we look at send, what is the other thing that we are sending in here? This is the HTTP response. So how are we going to handle the response? You can see the response body handler returns the response. So what are we going to say that we are getting back here? In this case, all we care about is the actual string. So we can say HTTP response, response.body handlers.of string. And I think that should give us that. And there's our response. Also, this is going to throw an exception. So we need to add an exception handler here. So now we have a response. Now we want to just return that raw string back to whoever is calling this, back to the caller. And in that, we could say response.body, and that will return the string. So I think this is going to be good. What do we have here? Field can be converted to a local variable. Yeah, that's okay. We're going to use it over and over. So, okay. So this is good so far. I'm going to do this in the application first, just so we can test this one method, and then we're going to introduce some tests. I mean, we should go about this the right way, right? But I just want to talk through this first. So in the application here, I'm going to create a new instance of my to-do client. So I could say to-do client equals new to-do client. And then I can say, hey, I want you to go ahead and just print out whatever that to-do client find all method is, right? So that looks good. Let's go ahead and run this. And there you go. So we have this just string. This is just raw data, right? But now we're talking to another service and we're getting back that JSON data. That is really exciting. Again, I think what we want to do now is actually turn this into a type. Like we want to deal with a list of to-dos. We don't just this raw string, right? Now to do this, we're going to have to bring in something that is capable of turning Jackson or JSON data into types. And that's where one of the libraries that does this really well is something called Jackson. So to do this, I'm going to go into my pom.xml. I'm going to declare a dependencies block. I'm going to declare a dependency called Jackson. I'm going to go ahead and set the version. I'll say jackson.version. I think I want 2.16. 2.16.0, and then I'll go ahead and refresh or reload Maven so it pulls in the project. Now what I'll do in here is I'll say private final object mapper. This comes from Jackson, and all I'll do here is say object mapper equals new object mapper. Now we can start to convert what we're getting back as a string into some JSON data. Now to do that, I'm going to need something that represents a to-do in our system. For that, I'm going to create a new record. So Java records are really a great way to kind of cut down on some verbosity. Create an immutable type here, means it doesn't change after we've created it. And I'll just go ahead and paste this in. This mirrors the data that we're getting back. It has a user ID, an ID, title, and whether it was completed or not. Okay, so far so good. Now what I need to do in the client is just change things a little and say, hey, what we're actually getting back from this is a list of to-dos. So a list of to-dos. Now, how can we get a list of to-dos? Because what we're getting back from that is actually a string. So what I want to do is just change whatever this is. I'm going to use the object mapper, and from the object mapper, I can call a read value. I'm going to pass in the response.body, so we just use that. And then I'm going to say like, okay, well, how can I get a list of things? In this case, I'm going to use something called the type reference, right? And that should give me that. Whoops. All right, there we go. And now that looks a little bit better. So let's go back to our application. And now we see that we are printing out the same thing, but let's say list of to-dos now, right? Call these to-dos and we can say, hey, to-do client.findAll. Now we can print out our to-dos. So again, I'm going to run my application. It doesn't look much different, but now we're working with actual types instead of some raw string. So that's a really good start, but let's actually write a test for this, and then we can start to implement all of the other methods. All right, so we aren't going to run this from the application. So what I'm going to do is just print something out and say, you should check out the tests. All right, so now we have that. Let's clean up those imports. And now we need to write a test class for our to-do client. So here I'm going to generate this, and I'm going to say generate a test, and we'll say generate, it's going to be called to-do client test, and we'll say yes for find all. Now, I actually have not added any dependencies for this yet, so let's come into our Maven build here. I'm going to paste some couple of dependencies in here. So we're bringing in JUnit 5, which is JUnit Jupyter. We're bringing in the engine and the API, basically. Now we can go ahead and write some tests against this. So I'm going to close that. This can be at test. Oh, and anytime you bring in any dependencies in Maven, here in IntelliJ, we'll want to make sure we reload those. So we'll say test, and now I have a test. And now what I can do is say I have a to-do client, and actually let's do this first. So let's say we're going to use the to-do client throughout our tests. So let's say that this to-do client is called client, and we'll say new to-do client. And this is really the system under test, or SUT for short, right? So from here, I'm going to say, hey, Copilot's really kicking in here. So let's say that I wanted to use the client to find all. This is going to return to me a list of to-dos. I'll call these to-dos. We'll also check to make sure that, so we're bringing in all the JUnit assertions through that static import. So I'll say assert equals, I want to make sure that I get 200 back. And so we'll say to-dos.size. And then we'll just go ahead and add an exception here. And now we have a way to test out this method that we wrote. Now this is really an integration test, right? Because we're testing this class, which has an outside dependency. So if you wanted to write more of a unit test, you could always mock that dependency outside, that HTTP call outside. But in this case, we're just actually testing it. So now I can run my test and let's see if that passes. And it does. Great. We are off and running. Now we can start to fill out the rest of our methods. Throughout the rest of this, I'm going to copy and paste some code just to cut down on the length of this video. I know you don't want to sit around and watch me type code. So the next one we'll do is should return to do given a valid ID. So we're going to say client.findByID. Here's a valid ID. And I expect what comes back is the this information. So the user ID is 1, the ID is 1, here's the title, and the completed is false. Now we haven't implemented this yet, so we're going to create the method here in our to-do client. Okay, so similar to the last one, we're going to start with the request. So the request is going to be a HTTP request.new builder. We're going to have a URI, so .URI. Remember, we need to create a URI, so we'll say URI.create. We'll say the base URL / and then whatever the integer's ID, the ID that comes in, we'll go ahead and pass that along with it. This will be a GET request, and we'll go ahead and build this. And that looks pretty good. Let me say var and get that call it request. And now that looks pretty good. Now we're going to do pretty similar to the same thing we did last time. So I'm going to copy this. So we're going to get a response back. And that is of type HTTP response. And now we need to return the object mapper. Again, we're using Jackson to read in that string and then turn it into something. In this case, it's going to be a single to-do. So we're just going to get a to-do. We're going to map it to that to-do class, which is a Java record. Right? So that looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and check out our, is anything okay? We need to add an exception for that. Now we look okay. Now let's go back and check out our test. We'll say at test. Whoops, I'm in the wrong class. Test, let's go ahead and run that and see if that passes. Oh, yeah, we didn't get to the exception stuff yet. So that's okay. Let's go ahead and run this. All right, now that passes. Now what I want to do is also introduce an exception. So what we can do here is we can say, hey, what happens when someone tries to access a to-do by its ID that doesn't exist? So for that, I'll have a method called should throw not found exception given invalid ID. What we're going to do here is expect that a to-do not found exception was thrown by the client when we call a particular ID, in this case 999. And then we're going to make sure that the method message is a particular message. So how can we do this? So I'll go in my to-do package. I'm going to create a new class. We're going to call this to-do not found exception, right? This class is going to extend throwable. And inside of here, we are going to say public to-do not found exception. This is going to take in a message, and we'll just call super and have this message. So now what I can do in my actual HTTP client here, so in to-do client, when I find by ID and I get that response back, I just want to check something on the response. I want to say if, Copilot's pretty good here. If response.status code equals 404, throw to-do not found exception. Cool. That's exactly what I want to do. So now back in my test, I need to do one more thing here. I need to say yes, that, and then this looks pretty good. So let's go ahead and try to run this. And yes, if we pass in an invalid ID, we throw that exception. Okay, and then just to round this out, again, I'm going to paste some code in here. We have a test to create a new to-do. We have a test to update an existing to-do. And we have a test to delete an existing to-do. So if we come in here and say that, oh, Yeah, this is just going to add that in there. So those are our tests. Let's go back to the client, and I'll just go ahead and again, paste some code in there. This is going to look pretty familiar, but there'll be a couple of differences, right? So for the create, we're accepting a to-do as an argument. And then when we call post, so this is different than the two previous ones. When we call the post method, we're actually saying, hey, I want to go ahead and send in this to-do data as JSON, right? So in this case, we're sending JSON. So we're using that object mapper to take a type and turn it into a string for us. So now that we have the request, same thing. We send it using the client. We get a response back. And in this case, all we're getting back is the response with a string inside of it. I think that'll contain the actual to-do. But for us, we just want to make sure that something got created there. Same thing with update. We are using the put method now. Same thing with delete. We are calling delete. So now we can go ahead in our client test and just check that all of these pass. All right, that's great. So there you have it. If you're in a Java application and you need to not talk to another service over HTTP, there are some great libraries out there. The Apache HTTP Commons is one, OKHTTP. If you're in a Spring app, there are some other APIs when dealing with talking to other services. But if you're just in a Java application, this is a really great resource because it's built into the JDK. If you're using something past JDK 11, you have this available to you. I like the intuitive API. You start with a client and then you have these requests and responses, right? That's what a HTTP client does. It sends requests, returns responses. So you can dive into those APIs further. There's more to explore there. But on the surface, we touched on being able to build out just a CRUD REST API that talks to another service. We even wrote some tests for it. So I thought this was a fun little exercise. So if you found value in this, do me a big favor, friends. Go ahead and give me a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel. And as always, happy coding.